Aluent Group is a sponsor of tonight's meeting and this presentation, thanks to my involvement. We're online at aluent.com. There's some information about the stuff we do. Joomla is one of our favorite solutions for content management, and it's really one of our primary tools. But it's not the only tool we use. We also use Drupal and some other web applications to implement the solutions that we do for our customers. And it kind of follows along the line, it's the best tool for the job. You know, Joomla can do a whole lot of stuff, but there are some things that it can't do. Let's see, here's my contact information. Right down here, just Justin at Aluent, phone number. Anyone who's interested, I encourage you to follow us on at Aluent on Twitter, and you can also like us on Facebook. We're going to be offering resources and some hopefully interesting information as part of our inbound marketing campaigns. Actually, there's going to be a nice treat for everyone at the end of the presentation, but we're going to be announcing it on these channels first, in addition to our blog. So that's a real good way to stay up on what we're doing. All right, Joomla and. Joomla and what? You know, there's so many content management systems out there of a whole bunch of wide varieties. I thought it would be good to just touch on the fact that there is a whole other market out there for quote-unquote content management systems. Enterprise CMS. These are the big boys, the big players that use terms like ECM or WCM. It stands for Enterprise Content Management and Web Content Management. Now, why are these guys getting paid all this money? You know, is it just because they're using better phrasing than we are? Actually, a lot of the systems that they specialize in do things in addition to managing the content of the website. It'll do things like scan through a whole bunch of unstructured information, like giant archives of Microsoft Word documents, parse through the information, and then kind of assemble it into usable taxonomies. And so that's, I guess, one characteristic that separates, you know, some of these enterprise level solutions from what we've been doing, but it's still good to know about them. I call them the big boys. These are the big contracts, $1 million contracts, giant monolithic pieces of software. I just wanted to touch on this. Gartner, the Gartner analytical firm, does all of this analysis of the CMS marketplace, and they named in the fall 2012 their quote-unquote leaders in the enterprise market: Oracle, Adobe, SDL, Sitecore, OpenText, HP Autonomy, and Ectron. And you know, you can see these are giant names that aren't necessarily tied to content management like we may think of it, but they still end up implementing those types of solutions at these really big companies. It was very interesting to note that in that same Gartner report, Acquia, which is the corporate, one of the big corporate backers of Drupal really, they ascended into the visionary quadrant for Gartner's analysis. So they're kind of getting on the board in terms of what some of these bigger players are assessing. Of course, we have other open source content management systems, many, many options. Has anybody here tried like Concrete 5? Anybody tried that? Or what, OpenText, ModX? You know, the CMS Expo that Dennis mentioned that happens in the spring is an awesome way to get exposed to a whole bunch of different types of content management systems. And you know, the market is changing really, really rapidly. Despite that, there really are the top 3 in the open source market. And who can tell me what is the #1 most installed open source quote unquote content management system? WordPress. #2, Joomla. #3, Drupal. That's just by number of installations. Not necessarily a very accurate metric, I think. So let's touch on WordPress. Now, I had a WordPress guy lined up to show up tonight. He's built 50 WordPress sites and maintained them for clients. And I met him at the December Joomla Chicago meeting out in Palatine. And he's like, I'm getting away from WordPress. I still got a bunch of sites I got to maintain, but I'm moving to Joomla. And he had some really specific things he wanted to talk about, but he got pulled into a client emergency, and so he was unable to make it tonight. So he's unable to share his knowledge with us, but I know a little bit about WordPress, not too much. So, and in general, you know, anyone who wants to yell at me while I'm talking, yell at me, okay? You guys raise your hand, say, Justin, wait a minute, whatever. This is an interactive discussion. You guys don't have to, you know, keep your mouths closed or anything like that. Be happy to answer your questions. So why is WordPress so popular? Kind of sucks, right? I mean, what was your name, sir, back there at the back? So you said you're getting tired of WordPress, right?
Well, I'm getting limited by it.
Limited by it. How so? Like layout, design, content?
Layout, design, add-ons.
Add-ons, you try to...
I can answer the other question confidently because so many people come from Blogger.
Come from what?
Blogger.
Yes, exactly. You know, every grandma out there who's going to put up a website is probably going to use WordPress on Blogger. Every cat who has their blog is probably going to put it on WordPress. And why? Because it's the best available blogging platform. You know, for blogging, it's awesome. There probably is nothing better. But it is a blogging platform, and that's what it started out as, and that still is what its pedigree, and it still shows it when trying to do stuff. Many people say that it is not a quote-unquote real CMS. They're trying to put content management system or a CMS-focused site on a WordPress platform is like putting a square peg in a round hole.
Just how big is the square peg?
Yeah, exactly. How much wiggle room you got. You know, here's a little meme I made. You know, you're going to have a bad time if you try to take WordPress and make it do a whole bunch of stuff that's not a blog. Now, I'm not a WordPress expert, so I want to ask anyone, am I full of crap?
You're right.
Am I right? All right, any other WordPress? Someone back there said they worked with WordPress. Estelle, you folks?
WordPress
Yeah?
is good for small, not good for big.
So like a little small brochureware sites, maybe a small bed and breakfast run by grandma and grandpa. Is that your experience too, sir?
Yeah.
Okay.
We
Yes.
have a lot of people using WordPress, small businesses, even restaurants are using it, and where they wouldn't be able to manage Joomla. They don't have a budget for someone to do the updates.
Exactly. It's simple, it's easy, it's intuitive. You can log in there and throw your stuff up easily.
You don't have a budget for someone to update Joomla for every time a security patch comes along, then...
But don't you have to update WordPress too, right?
Yes, but you can do it from inside.
Ah, okay.
You just go into WordPress admin, it says these things need to be updated, you click the button, they update.
So easy peasy.
Yeah.
It's also not as capable in a lot of different areas. Yeah.
It's also really easy to optimize for search, probably easier than Joomla.
Interesting.
By far.
Interesting. Yeah.
Just one point. I've worked with WordPress. I've got some clients who have been using WordPress so long, it's so large, they're using it as CMS because the concept of moving to anything else is just so daunting.
I've heard about that too, yeah.
But it is a decent, it does manage content. You just end up with all these restrictions, and especially if you have somebody to manage WordPress, there's a lot you can do. You will end up against a glass ceiling at some point.
But you can, yeah, you can put in an e-commerce functionality, you can kind of shoehorn that in, you can put in, I don't know, document management or some other capability, but it's always going to be kind of a kludge, right? You're always kind of working around the core blogging element. I've heard too that layouts and design is really tough to implement in WordPress, like to have a very completely custom design that gets away from the blogging standard. Anyway, we're not going to dwell too much in WordPress because I don't know that much about it. And it sounds like, you know, everybody here is kind of, you know, of a similar persuasion. What we're mostly going to talk tonight about is Drupal, because Drupal and Joomla are most often compared to each other in my experience, and in many ways they have a similar level of capabilities. Most of tonight's presentation is going to focus on Drupal, and then I also wanted to tell everyone, you know, I started working with Aluent Group this past fall, and Aluent Group does Joomla stuff, they do Drupal stuff, they work with other web applications. And so when I started digging into Drupal this past fall, learning more about it, learning how it works, playing around with it a little bit. But there's a very steep learning curve to using Drupal, especially compared to Joomla. So, you know, although I'm going to do my best to explain, you know, what I understand the differences to be between Drupal and Joomla, there may be some areas where my knowledge is incomplete, which is why we have our special guest, Cody Carlson, right there, who runs a company called FamilyDev.net. Here's his contact information. Cody is a Drupal expert, and he is here to keep me honest, and he is here to also answer any questions that the group might have about Drupal and serve as our resource this evening. So thanks much, Cody. Do you want to say anything more about your company or anything like that?
Yeah, I didn't really say much before. We're a local Chicago Drupal shop. Well, I guess we're not really, two of our like 12 employees live in Chicago. We're a virtual shop. I got into it originally because I had no job and I had no money and I had no house. And my good friend was like, well, why don't I pay you $10 an hour so you can look at these spreadsheets and these, junk up. And I have like a family. I grew up with computers. I ran a BBS in the early 90s with my father when I was a little kid and stuff. So that's how he kind of got me into it. And I came into with no web development experience whatsoever and no job experience in IT whatsoever. And now I do it full time. And I've since been able to get a wife and everything, so I must be doing okay. So that's my and I do nothing but Drupal, and I do all 95% of the work I do is like within Drupal, like point and click. I don't do like big I don't do installs or system administration or any of that sort of stuff. And I really don't even write like custom PHP code much at all either or anything like that. It's definitely not CSS. I leave that to the design people. I specialize just in making things work in the Drupal site, and I design mostly like site architecture. Like these are your content types, these are the content types fields, these are the modules we're going to use to make this work. And I'm usually like the frontline guy. I go in there, make everything, make all the content types, build most of the functionality, and typically, ideally, we have somebody come in afterwards and make it look great. And you'd be surprised how far I can take a site point and click.
Very interesting. Well, thanks so much, Cody, for being here. Cody, you can just yell out if I'm talking some falsehood, and anyone else can do that too, as a matter of fact. I like hecklers, I guess. But we're really happy to have you here, and I'll probably be pinging Cody as we move through this presentation to make sure we've got things that I'm speaking of things accurately. So let's compare Joomla and Drupal. And how do we do that? Well, first of all, let's take a look at some well-known similarities between these two content management systems. Both of them run or have a preference for the LAMP-based hosting environment. That stands for Linux operating system, the Apache web server, MySQL database, and PHP scripting language. Now, of course, there's WAMP and Windows, Apache, MySQL, PHP, and there's other flavors that will work on either or both platforms. But kind of both of them come out of this environment. Both of them are open source. I believe Drupal's GPL version 2 as well, or?
I'm not really sure.
Okay, but I know that it's one of the flavors of GPL. All of the freedoms of Joomla, take it, build something, use it, create a service on it, customize it, etc. Both are very much community-driven projects. Everybody knows about Joomla's massive community and the fact that it really is just driven 100% by community support. Drupal has an awesome and huge community as well. They have big websites, Drupal.org, with lots of participation. There are a whole bunch of local users groups as well, and you're involved pretty heavily in those.
Yeah.
I've actually been invited to speak on April 10th. I think I'm going to go to the Drupal users group and talk to them about Joomla, so they can see how the other half lives, or I'm going to do some sort of comparison. But it's a really cool group of people, and it's real similar to Joomla in many ways, or the Joomla community. Both of them are market proven. I mean, both of them have made massive inroads into the market. There are businesses that have been built solely on either technologies, and both of which are very good at quote-unquote content management. But as we'll see as we move through the presentation, what exactly does content management mean? That can mean a whole bunch of different things. And there are all these different subtleties that tie into how it gets implemented. Now, there's also some well-known differences between Drupal and Joomla. Drupal comes from Dries Breifert, who is this brilliant guy. I met him last year at CMS Expo. Hopefully he'll be at the next CMS Expo. He built Drupal starting in the mid-90s, wasn't it? Or 2000, released Drupal, and it's kind of this project that grew and grew and grew and grew. And he's remained sort of the main guy behind it. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I know there's a bigger organization.
University of Antwerp, and he built it before blogs were even called blogs. He built basically a blogging thing, so him and his classmates could communicate, and it just kind of escalated.
And it grew and grew, and commercial sites and business options, but he remains kind of the face of Drupal in certain ways. You know, he's the guy who gets out there and talks about it. Brilliant, nice guy. If he's at CMS Expo, just go straight up to him and talk to him. He's very accessible. As everybody knows, Joomla forked from Mambo back in 2005. That's when I started working with it. Open source project. Joomla guys didn't like what the Mambo guys were doing, said screw you guys, taking the ball and going home, and made their own content management system. Another difference that's pretty well known is Drupal is supported by Acquia, which is a large commercial venture capital-backed corporation. Did you want to add to that?
I don't know if that's the right way to say it.
Maybe it's not backed by it, but it's...
They're like the biggest Drupal company.
Yes. And they, I mean, don't they also contribute to the core and like
Yeah,
give back?
But they're by no means like the biggest contributor to core.
Okay. So, but that everything that I've heard is like Acquia, because there's this giant corporate player kind of behind the scenes. It helps the market, helps push the product forward.
In the community, like the Acquia guys are like...
The super studs?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, you're getting paid the most money.
The ones that everybody kind of knows, you know. So,
Sure.
But yeah, they're not. It's not like Acquia owns Drupal or
Yes.
anything like that. It's just the company that Dries works. That Dries started.
Yes. Kendall.
There is a Drupal Foundation, right?
Yeah, there's a Drupal Foundation, right?
Is it's kind of like Open Source Matters is to the Joomla project?
I'm not really sure.
So Open Source Matters, which is up here, is the not-for-profit foundation that maintains the Joomla trademark.
Yeah.
So basically they put the lockdown on how you can use Joomla and what you can call.
Yeah. Right.
So and I guess I put Acquia up here because that's the comparison I continued to hear, and it, even though it's, like you said, they don't own the code, it's like there's such a huge driver in the community. Yeah, Dennis.
What do you think about comparison Acquia to eBay?
Well, that I was going to mention, you know, eBay is a company that has invested massively in Joomla. They, you know, bought up all the top Joomla talent practically. You know, they hired, who did they hire? They hired Louis Landry.
Andrew Eddy.
Oh, Andrew Eddy's, everybody's working for eBay.
Kyle Ledbetter. Jeremy Wilkerson.
So, you know, there's some corporate players on Joomla side as well, but they, you know, eBay's been pretty behind the scenes. I mean, eBay's been using Joomla for their local intranet. They haven't, it seems like Acquia is very much a public-facing, you know, we'll build you solutions, and eBay is much more using it for internal purposes, but they're still supporting or effectively supporting the advancement of the CMS.
Yeah, they do like they also do they also offer support. It's like their big thing for like their hosting and
right, Drupal Gardens, right? So
yeah, that's another one. I'm not sure if that's I get confused by all.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I'm so engrossed in my own work, I don't have time to pay attention to those guys. But
Okay.
But they also, that's like Acquia's big like money making thing. It's like, you know, support.
Sure.
Because then, you know, they can take on really big projects, and there's actually somebody there to answer the phone when there's a problem.
Right, and companies will pay good money for that.
Somebody to hold the ball when everything goes down.
Right. A vendor to blame.
Right. Exactly.
So you don't get fired for your job. You can blame the vendor. No, just kidding.
And from the same side, you've got Automatic on the WordPress side. That's very
Right.
similar. Matt Mullenbeck, I think is his name.
Oh, okay.
He's actually the head of Automatic, which is basically, there may be a foundation as well on the WordPress side, but they're basically kind of the person that everybody looks to for what WordPress is doing.
Interesting. So it looks like there's a lot of these corporate players that, even though they're not officially involved, they're still supporting what's going on behind the scenes. Another well-known difference is that, you know, Joomla's got a separate back-end administrator. You got the front end of the site you can log into, do stuff. If you want to do administrative things, you log into an entirely separate area, the back end of the site. Drupal focuses more on kind of putting this control panel overlay on top of the existing site. So the interface is quite a bit different. As you surf through the site, you've got this additional, depends on how the template renders it, but a bar across the top with administrative controls and things like that. And it's more closely connected to the site than being a separate area. And these are all pretty, you know, well-documented differences that people have already talked about. Now here's the conventional wisdom. You know, use Drupal for big/complicated sites, use Joomla for simpler, easier sites. And you know, that's not really totally accurate, because there may be a big site that is much more appropriate for Joomla, like in terms of the amount of content it's serving up or its audience or whatever. Just like maybe there's some sort of smaller but very specific website that has specific features and functionality that would be better engineered through Drupal. So how do you compare them, you know? CMS to CMS, they're both fruits, but it is kind of like comparing apples to oranges, because they do end up being so fundamentally different in many ways, and we're going to get into that and dig into that. What I have done, or how I've approached it, and what we're going to do for this presentation is we're going to break it down into project phases or platform capabilities. So we'll look at a particular topic and then compare Joomla against Drupal. And I found that to be a pretty good way to both assess what the capabilities are of either and their, whether or not they'll fit into a particular project, as well as just being a good way to take a look, a good way to understand the fundamental systemic differences between the two platforms. And we're going to be getting into that. What I hope you guys come out with of this presentation is kind of like a mental understanding of why the approach to Drupal is so much different than the approach to a Joomla site, and why it may be much more complicated and expensive to implement a Drupal site than a Joomla site. So let's talk about our first phase, setup and installation, just basic setup and installation of the website. A number of things are involved. Hosting environment setup. Now, as I mentioned before, both platforms prefer a LAMP stack, will run well in commodity LAMP-based hosting environments. One thing that's a little bit different on the Drupal end, and this is, I guess, part of its more enterprise-focused heritage, is that when setting up Drupal, you have the option to implement load balancing options. So you can distribute a Drupal site across a server environment a little bit easier, or quite a bit easier than Joomla, just because it has inbuilt capabilities to do so. And then the other big thing too, that Drupal, this is a huge thing, a huge difference, is that Drupal supports multi-site capabilities, whereas Joomla does not, or does not support it natively at all. So with the Drupal site, you can have different websites at different domains that are still being powered off of the same Drupal system, and that's true, right? And you can also get the different websites to interact with each other and share information and talk back and forth and do any number of different things. Joomla's multi-site capabilities, they're kind of two options. One is an enterprise option, which is ridiculously expensive, and then the other one, I haven't tried it, and I forget the name of it. JMS multi-site. It's a combination, Joomla extension and server configuration, and it seems pretty complicated. It also seems, it's definitely a third-party solution. It's not something that's like baked into the core of Joomla. Yes?
When you say Drupal has multi-site, I just looked into WordPress has multi-site, but really only with subdomains or some subfolders, not with totally different domains.
We have totally different domains. Totally different domains. Like currently, if we're doing built in Chicago, it's a pretty big website, and there's like built in LA, built in,
And can you have, just a quick question, can you have the multi-site deployment on distributed servers, distributed web hosting environment servers, or pretty much do they always live on the same server?
That question, I don't really know.
Okay, I would guess that it's going to be easier to have them all on the same server and then just have the server's DNS, pointing things to where they should go. Okay.
Not my department, sorry.
Not a worry, topic for another day. Development environment. Development environment is your sandbox server. It's your version control software for the changes you're making to the code itself. If you're working with a team, you have to kind of coordinate this stuff. Basically, development environment setup is pretty similar between Joomla and Drupal. There's not a whole lot of difference. One thing that I read that was interesting about Drupal is that it's possible to put PHP code in the database, which would totally hose your version control or development. So there's development patterns that can, put you down the wrong path in Drupal, and I think there are a number of places like that in Drupal, and that's a characteristic of Drupal.
It's something that I constantly have to tackle. I'll take on a lot of jobs where there are failed people who say, okay, we're a Drupal shop, we're going to do Drupal. they get halfway into it, and then they're like, they give up. And the reason why, and then I'll see the project, I'd say 9 times out of 10, I just end up rebuilding it from scratch. Because they spent so much time just trying to push things through with like custom code and all that, instead of doing it like the way that Drupal intends for you to do it.
Yes. And we're gonna come back to that. Those are excellent points, and I've got some points touching on those a little bit down the road. But you know, as far as development environment, you know, if you're following good practices, best practices, I think it's pretty similar between developing a Joomla site and developing a Drupal site, assuming that you have a sandbox server and you have a development server and a production server, and you know, if you're using SVN or Git or whatever to manage your code, it can be quite similar from a cost perspective. CMS installation and initial configuration, these are very similar as well. You know, with Joomla, you upload the archive to the server, you unpack it, so you've got your file directory structure. You go to cPanel, you set up your database, you go to a particular URL in your installation, and then it kind of walks you through step by step. Very streamlined, especially in Joomla 3. Real similar process in Drupal as well. When I was reading about this and playing around with it, it looked like there might be a couple of additional steps for Drupal that might be required for like changing file permissions on the server, but nothing onerous. You know, effectively it's just about the same or a real similar process. All right, let's talk about content types and structures within the content management systems. This is like the start of where the real differences between the content management systems start to manifest. Let's do a quick overview of Joomla's content types and structures. Joomla ships or installs by default with these core content types. So we've got articles, which is equivalent to Joomla's default web page. We've got banners, we've got web links, we've got contacts. What am I leaving out? There's one or two more core content types. Throughout these content types, Joomla pushes this nested category system, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. Top level categories, they can have children, the children can have children, etc. Every content item resides at one particular spot within that hierarchy. And then third-party extensions are available to implement other quote-unquote content types. You know, Joomla doesn't have a native e-commerce component, for example, or e-commerce capability. So a component might come in and give you a catalog, and you could have an object for sale, or it could be a document management system, and you're adding kind of core or adding additional content types to the mix. Drupal is very, very different, a very different approach from this. Drupal has custom content types. So when you install Drupal, you don't have articles or web links or contacts or these predefined things that you can choose from. You know, I think Drupal 7 gives you one basic content type or two basic content types.
Basic page and article.
Okay, so it gives you like these two very basic content types called a page and an article. And I mean, really basic stuff, like just a couple fields and then some common controls between these content types. It is up to the Drupal developer to define what types of content that website needs. So if you're building a recipe website, you're going to have to build a recipe content type. If you want to build the capability for that website to have, Joomla type article capabilities, maybe you take Drupal's article and, match it up or call it something else, call it a story or whatever. But, you would build your own custom content type depending on what you wanted the website to do. And so that's very, very different. The developer from the get-go has to think of what in the world am I going to deliver. I don't have this thing that I'm working from to start. Content types are built from what are called fields. So you have a content type and you build a content type by defining any number of different fields to it. So for Joomla, for example, say a Joomla article were a content type, one of the fields might be the title field, and another might be the content field, and another might be the alias field, and then another field might be the metadata description field. The Drupal developer, when you build a content type, you basically say, okay, this content type is going to include all of these different types of fields, and there's a whole bunch of other configuration options that we'll touch on, or we'll reference moving forward. But basically, it's kind of this hand-built thing, this class of content that the Drupal developer has to build. Whereas the Joomla developer, oh, I've already got an article type to work with, or I've got a web link or whatever it is. Am I on track?
Yeah, you're right.
Okay, cool.
So you don't get to classify your own content types in Joomla?
Well, okay, so in Joomla, you get third-party extensions that may give you another type of capability, quote unquote, but it's sort of like content types. Joomla also has third-party CCK extensions which install into Joomla that type of modeling available to Drupal, but Drupal, I mean, that's all it is. It is content types. The Drupal developer has to figure this stuff out from the get-go, and like I said, the stuff that installs initially is extremely basic. So you really do have to plan on building it out from there. Okay, vocabularies and taxonomies. This is a really cool aspect of Drupal that I think the Joomla project could learn from. As mentioned before, Joomla has this structured hierarchy of categories and subcategories, and that's kind of the default way the components work, and the components categorize content. In Drupal, you have the option to define what are called vocabularies, and a vocabulary can be a specific set of terminology, and there are a couple of different types of vocabularies. You can have a nested vocabulary, so it's like a hierarchy. You can have a flat vocabulary where all of the terms are equal, or you can have sort of like this ad hoc vocabulary, so as a producer's entering content into the system, they're just kind of adding more tags, or vocabulary terms would be equivalent, I think, to tagging in Joomla for the.
It is, and it's actually only one type of vocabulary.
Oh, okay.
There's just different widgets to input into the vocabulary. Like you can limit, like you can set up your content type so that when that particular type of content is created, the user can create their own terms.
Yes.
Or you can force them to choose out of predetermined terms.
Yes.
And you can have them, and all of them, initially they're set up all on the same hierarchy, but
okay.
they're all adjustable. So.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. I also understand that you associate vocabularies with a content type, right? And here's the key. You can associate more than one vocabulary with a content type, right?
More than one content type with one vocabulary.
Or more than one content type with one vocabulary. So in Joomla, we got our hierarchy tree, we got our single content item, it sits in one spot and that's where it lives, right? In Drupal, you have these content types with all of these potential self-built hierarchies and structures which can be selectively applied to individual content types or not. So is everybody kind of understanding what's going on there and how both the range of structural options this gives you, but also the massive complexity that it potentially could create? So
I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, no, go. That's cool.
Another huge thing, in my opinion, especially in Drupal 7, is that in Drupal 7 now, which is the most recent stable release or whatever, taxonomy or your vocabularies can actually have fields as well. So like your vocabulary, let's say if it's colors, right? And let me think of another one. Let's say if you're doing a site and you're tracking behavior of people, and when you're recording somebody's behavior, you're creating content type, a behavior thing, and then what you do is you tag it to say what kind of behavior.
Right.
It could be coughing, walking, running, sleeping, and coughing, running, walking, sleeping can have their own set of attributes. So you could be like coughing. Coughing is worth 2 points.
A dry cough,
This is
or
worth 4 points, or whatever. And so then, like when you list that content, you can also show the related value of the term that's tagged to the content. Does that make sense?
That makes sense to me. Is everybody kind of getting this topic? Is there any questions? Okay, we're kind of getting into the I don't know, philosophical or the conceptual areas of this. Now, taxonomies. The taxonomy is a taxonomy module, right? And can't you build taxonomies based upon these vocabulary settings, and is that how that works?
Taxonomy is like, what do you guys have now? You guys don't have modules, you have add-ons?
Well, we have extensions.
Right?
Yeah.
So taxonomy is an extension of Drupal.
It's not. I thought it was a core part of the install. I think as of Drupal 7, it said it was.
I don't know.
Okay, no worries.
What's core and what's not core. There's so many modules that you use over and over and over again, you kind of forget if it's
Sure,
core or not.
sure.
But I'm sorry, I forgot what your initial question.
So how taxonomies relate to vocabularies?
Oh, right. Well, taxonomy basically gives you the platform to use vocabulary. So once you turn on taxonomy, you have a little thing, you know, in your menu. It'll say taxonomy, and then it'll say vocabularies. And you can create new vocabularies like colors.
Okay.
I don't know what.
So taxonomy is sort of the control panel to manage your vocabularies.
It's like you have content types, and then you have taxonomies, and you can apply those taxonomies to content types. And each taxonomies, vocabularies is just like a set of, it's like a collection of, it's like a collection of attributes, I guess.
Sure.
So you might have a color taxonomy, and it's all different colors.
It's very confusing, or it can be.
It sounds like it's really not that confusing if you look at it.
It's kind of, yeah. It's
I don't know. The best way I can explain it is like I had we do this website, and they have all these different kinds of things like white papers, webinars, and all these different things, right? And so their webinars might be about like business practices or all these different topics. But their white papers might also be about those same different topics. Well, those topics are in a vocabulary called topics. And so even though webinars and white papers are different content types, they both get tagged from the same vocabulary. So you can tell what those white papers and webinars are actually, or what they.
Right, and you can mix and match and create whatever types of lists or results you want.
And then on top of that, your content type could actually be just like resources, and you could have two taxonomies. One that would be like what type of resource, so it could tell that you could use just one content type, and then use the taxonomy to detail whether or not it's a white paper or a webinar, instead of having a white paper content type and a webinar content type.
So there's like a gazillion ways to skin a cat.
Yeah, the possibilities are endless. I mean,
that's a good overall statement of Drupal. The possibilities are endless. Now there's also something called views. Now, what I understand to be a sort of developer-built views into the content. So you're kind of building it like kind of in Joomla. We've got a similar sort of concept.
To say it's a point-and-click way to build a database.
Okay, thank you very much. And you can leverage things like vocabularies and taxonomy to do that.
That's part of the strength in Drupal of having the vocabularies, the taxonomy, and the fields and content. If you have fields and content, excuse me, you can sort through views.
Yes.
You can take content that applies to a particular taxonomy or vocabulary, and you can say, I want that kind of content that has these attributes.
Yes, and that's a view, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Or you can say, I want to see any kind of content that has this vocabulary term.
Okay, so that's a whole lot different in terms of conceptual approach than in Joomla, where it says, all right, point at this individual content item, or point at this level of the hierarchy and show me everything that's in there.
Drupal sort of looks at content as a structured data entity.
Yes.
And Joomla looks at content as different kinds of articles.
Yes.
Very much like verbally.
Yes, that's a good way to describe it. It's like it's fundamentally conceptually different in terms of its approach. Now I want to mention the term node. In Drupal, a node is an individual content item or one instance of a particular content type. So it would be like, the actual article of, welcome to Joomla Chicago, in the particular in a particular category, and if it's an article type. But that's basically a content item, is what Drupal calls it. Let's talk about site navigation. In Joomla, everybody's probably real familiar with the menu manager, the concept of, you can have multiple menus in a Joomla site, and then menu items inside of those menus, which basically end up being hyperlinks that point to different locations. And then menu items are of a particular menu item type. In other words, that menu item points toward a particular type of Joomla content, whether an article or a contact or a directory of contacts or whatever it might be. And then menu items have their own parameters. So when you're defining a menu item, the developer who's created that menu item gives you all these choices for, well, do you want to show the article title? Do you want to show the byline or things like that? Drupal also has menu capabilities built in through what it's called its menu module. I don't know why that's auto-advancing. Now, I use the term module here, which in Drupal describes kind of a discrete piece of software which integrates with the Drupal site and can enable any number of different types of functionality, or it can maybe handle a back-end process. It might or it might not be connected to front-end display. It's is that not the case, or?
It's like your extensions.
So exactly. So I would say a module is kind of the equivalent to a component in Joomla. Would you agree, or?
Smaller.
I was going to say it's probably more like an extension. In Joomla, extensions are broken out into plugins, modules, and components.
Oh, I see.
3 different types. But it seems like in Drupal, all those things are encompassed.
Right, like a module might have the logic to power the thing that it's doing, but then it also might have a block, right, that is responsible for displaying the content.
Yeah, well, a module can include a number of different things. I mean, it can come with pre-built blocks or views. Even
Sure.
We're talking about could even come with, no, not so much pre-built content, but it can be as small as, a module can be as small and as specific as giving you a type of field to add. Like,
Right.
for example, a date field.
Right.
A date field module is one thing, and you can't put a date field on your content type without the date module.
Sure.
It could also be as big as taxonomy or menu.
So it's like in Joomla, we've got some components that maybe install into the backend and they're only visible on the backend. Like there's a backup component, you know, and then we've got other components that are almost like their own web application, like an e-commerce component, and that component may talk to these other Joomla elements called plugins and modules. In Joomla, modules are more like akin to a block. But you know, I guess in terms of trying to think about a module, I see it as a discrete piece of software that kind of does a specific thing and that has a wide variety of options for how it can hook into the rest of the Drupal site. Is that accurate enough for tonight? The menu, there's a menu module, this discrete piece of software in Drupal which is designed for managing menus, and it allows the management of menu items and then also menu blocks. Now this is another Drupal specific terminology where in Drupal a module can kind of have this output element called a block, which, you know, I kind of equate to a Joomla module where you might have a component that's feeding, you know, a Joomla component that's feeding Joomla module, you know, some information and it's displaying it on the front end. It's somewhat similar to how a Drupal module may have blocks capabilities, and so it's like this little widget that can drop into the page selectively and show some content or data or interact with the module in some way. Yes?
So I want to use, like, get away from the terminology.
Okay.
Just say, so in Joomla, let's say we have a page, and only on this page do we want the login form to show up on the top right? I'm sure Drupal can do that. WordPress allows you to do that, but it must apply to every page.
Right.
Does Drupal allow you to specify where it does and does not belong?
Yeah, and then there's all different levels of how you can control that. You can control it by the type of user that's logged in. You can control it by the current alias that you're on, the URL that you're at. You can control it by specific permissions, not even just users, but by permissions. And then we actually have another module called contacts where you can build, oh my gosh, there's so many different things that you can do that will control how and when and where blocks show up. All blocks are is, I mean, it's literally like you have, you know, on your typical website, like a sidebar, your main content area, a header. A block is just a container for putting content in it. So like a block can be as simple as just having a title and a body. It could be a view block, you know, a view that's being displayed in a block, or it could be a menu block is another example.
And what you talked about in terms of blocks can be controlled from a whole bunch of different levels. That's another key characteristic and difference that I've noticed between Joomla and Drupal. You know, Joomla, you kind of control things from one spot in the control panels that the developers have shown to you. In Drupal, you can get in and you can manage appearance options for blocks, probably at the module level. Like the module can control block display and how it's displayed. Parts of the theme or template can control how blocks get rendered. There can be conditional logic built into block display that Joomla just is not capable of. Joomla is much simpler.
Yeah, I mean, a really quick example would be you were talking about taxonomy. You could have certain blocks show up when you're looking at a piece of content that has a particular term. So you'd be like, whenever
Right.
you're looking at a particular piece of content that has the tag green on it, I want this block to show up. You do that as well.
Joomla has some modules like that. I think it's Modules Anywhere, and there's another module component, right, that's an extension to Joomla that provides that type of functionality that's native in Drupal. Let's keep cranking along, otherwise we're going to run out of time. That's my understanding. You can add a menu item from either the node edit screen, so, and tell me if this is common or not. You're working on an individual page or effectively like a node of content. You go there and you want to add a link to it. You can do it right from that screen. But then if you have to add it from the menu management area, then you have to paste in a Drupal specific URL, right?
No.
Okay.
You can paste in external URLs or any internal path.
But I mean, if it has to be an internal path. Oh, no.
Well, before you were talking about nodes. Every piece of content in Drupal is a node.
Right.
So it has its own like internal Drupal path, which is always like node / what they call the node ID that just counts up.
Sure.
So your first piece of content is node / 1. And then each node also has an alias that you can assign to it. So you can call node 1 home. But when you're making your menu, when you're putting in the link, you can type in either home or node 1. But it actually gets saved in the database as node 1.
So it'll hit either the number or the alias. I compare this like in Joomla, we're given a kind of a point and click interface where it pops up and says, oh, what do you want to link to? And it seems like in Drupal you have to know what you're pointing toward and actually paste in the path.
Yeah, you have to type it in.
Yeah.
Again.
So slight difference. Not a big deal. I've also read that menus need to be associated with the content type. If you're going to have a menu with a content menu item, is that wrong?
Yeah, I don't know what you really mean by that.
Okay, I just thought that was a requirement that may be tied into the Drupal system. Let's move on.
You can actually, maybe what you saw and you're thinking about when you're creating new content types, you can say, how you were mentioning, you can add a menu item from the node creation.
Yes.
I think when you create the content type, you can limit which menus you can add that node to from the node creation form.
Okay, so you can not let your users add menu items and.
Content type, if you want users to be able to add it to a menu, you can selectively limit which menus they can add.
Okay, interesting. Another like example of the deeper level of control and complexity that comes through Drupal. All right, let's move on. We got to keep cranking on. My time is now up, but I got a lot more to talk about. I'm just going to keep cranking if that's cool with you guys. Site design and layout. Joomla, we're all familiar with it. Templates. We got template styles where template parameters can get saved with different values. Then you save a different template style for a template. Templates are associated with menu items, or template assignment is associated with the menu items. Templates are basically built from index.php that describes the core layout of your template page, and then a template XML file that has all the metadata in it, plus CSS, images, whatever else you want to add. Joomla Templates defines layout quote-unquote positions, or in other words, the layout regions on the page where Joomla modules will reside. Drupal has a bit of a different approach. Some of it's similar, some of it's a bit different. Drupal calls its quote-unquote templating system themes. Like Joomla, they're a collection of files and folders in a hierarchy, inside the Drupal installation. One of the key differences is that Drupal themes follow this kind of nested code structure, whereas Joomla has one index.php file which lays out like kind of the core layout of the page and maybe has some conditional logic for display and stuff. Drupal will have like one PHP file define the the outermost page wrapper, and then another PHP file define a deeper wrapper, and then another PHP file define different blocks and different regions of the page. So they all kind of get loaded in kind of this nesting schema, and so that's one difference that I noticed. Oops.
Justin, have you worked with both of those?
With both templates or with both?
Both the template structure.
I have not, or I've only played around with it in Drupal. I mean, I consider myself an expert Joomla template implementer. In terms of Drupal, I've only just dabbled, and I've never been involved in a full-blown site. That's why we have our expert here. So you don't do design?
No, I don't do any design.
Damn hippies!
Sad about it too, man.
Yeah, stick with the code, man. Stick with the.
Not my. I don't want to know either.
So.
I'll make it work. You guys make it pretty.
The nested code structure is one of the differences that I noticed. It uses this .info file to kind of define the template and set up parameters and information about the template and made it kind of like the Joomla XML file. And then there are all these, whatever the file name is, .tpl, .php, or these PHP template files, which create this nested structure, and then whatever else you want to add in, CSS, images, whatever other resources you want to tie in. Now themes, in terms of layout, they define regions, quote unquote regions. So that's the equivalent of Joomla's positions. So they define these layout regions, and then blocks get loaded into the regions. Yes?
Does it define them through the nested files? Like there's going to be a region?
I believe it defines it right up here, and then I think that it calls. Yes, do you?
Yeah, I used to be a Joomla developer now.
Oh, cool.
I can say that Drupal has a nested overriding structure, so that what you do is based on the directory. For example, if you have a multi-site setup, you have /all that has a theme for all your sites. But then again, you have overrides in anything that's different. Then you say H or 1, 6, or whatever that overrides.
Like WordPress hierarchy involved?
I'm not sure. Similar, but
Yeah, there. I've heard about it. It's called SubThemes, or that's what I've read about it being, where you can have sort of like a top-level theme, right? That could be your wireframe. Say you're a designer, or you're approaching a client, and you want to show them a bunch of different options. You could have your top-level theme be your wireframe, or the structure for stuff, and then you could have sub-themes which leverage and call upon resources in the parent theme, but then selectively override whatever it might be. It might be a new CSS file, it might be new display logic, it might be a new layout, whatever it might be, but it could be, it seems relatively complicated and complex, but could be really slick for certain work scenarios. As you mentioned, Drupal has support for layout overrides. Joomla has this system called HTML overrides. In Drupal, it's real similar. You create a more specific tpl.php file, put it in the hierarchy. Drupal automatically recognizes that it's there and uses that display logic instead. One other thing that's very interesting about Drupal themes is that from what I've seen, there tends to be of presentation and even functional logic inside the theme itself. Maybe it's not there, maybe it is there, but it can be there. Most Joomla templates, if they have some sort of PHP involvement going on, it's all related to display options. Is it's going to be is anything in this sidebar? If not, don't render it and make the column area wider. Drupal's themes have the capability to say, okay, if the following user conditions are true, then implement the theme in a certain way. And I'm right in that. Now, once again, you could put that logic in a totally a different part of Drupal, right? You can put it in the module, you can put it somewhere else. It's another characteristic of Drupal. Where do you put this stuff? There's so many options for how you can build it, and there are a number of best practices which have developed, requires Drupal expertise.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's the sort of stuff that drives me crazy.
Yes. Even a Drupal expert is going crazy sometimes.
Well, no, what drives me crazy is when I take over projects where people do stuff like that in the theme when it shouldn't be there. Yes, and I've read too that there's a best practice in Drupal. There's one top-level index.php file. You're supposed to put all of your logic and all your PHP stuff in that top-level one location. That's a best practice, but lots of people don't. You don't have to. Maybe it's faster for a sloppy coder, sloppy lazy guy to just slap it in somewhere else, and you got to go clean it up when the project implodes. It's actually quicker for me to do it the right way.
Right, and I'm going to come.
People just aren't aware of how to get there.
Exactly, and to come to that. One other thing I wanted to mention too is the panels module. Have you ever used panels? Okay, panels module, it seems like it's kind of a Swiss Army knife. It can do a number of different things. One thing that I've heard it can do is like drag and drop layout options.
Yeah.
It can also tie into other systemic things like caching or things like that. It can be used to render content in certain ways. Do you want to briefly?
So
yeah, but it seems like it's
Yeah.
not universally. I know that Aluent doesn't use any panels.
it makes certain things easier to manipulate visually, I guess you could say. Like you can turn on panels and then put. I don't know. I don't want to talk about it.
All right. So anyway,
Typically don't use it.
it's yet another layout option. There's so many options in Drupal, and you could implement things that way.
But there's a lot of people that really swear by it.
Yeah.
And because I don't use it doesn't mean that I'm right
Yes.
or wrong.
Let's keep cranking on. Let's talk about some editorial tools. All right, WYSIWYG editor. Joomla's got a WYSIWYG editor. Drupal doesn't. You know, that's the big neener thing that they say. But Drupal, of course, has a third-party WYSIWYG capability that can be just dropped right in and enabled through a field on a content type. Just like, you know, in Joomla, hardly anybody uses the default editor. Everybody installs JCE. Real similar type of concept. But you could technically say Joomla has a default WYSIWYG editor. This also ties into like the nature of the content management system, right? Because Drupal, it's just content type or fields and content types. You know, most fields may not need a WYSIWYG editor. You know, you just want the data, and then the template decides how it's presented. Publishing controls, embargo, expiry, etc. Both systems have these basic types of controls, including in Drupal. Versioning, content versioning, where you say, all right, you know, no, erase the changes that the stupid intern made to my press release and step it back to my original version. Drupal has versioning like baked into the system. I believe is a default control panel on just about every content type by default, right?
It has revisions.
Or revision. That's what I call versioning. So this revisions capability.
Or not, but yeah, it's there.
So and from what Robert and some of the technical guys at Aluent have told me is it's pretty easy for a developer to hook into that process and kind of set up these versioning capabilities for publishing purposes. Joomla doesn't have anything like that. Even the third-party versioning capabilities that Joomla has, they're lame. They suck. You know, they're inadequate for any type of sophisticated publishing. Workflow. All right, Joomla has effectively no workflow or the ability to define, all right, the content goes from here to here, and that at each step of the phase, you know, certain users may have certain access to certain things. Drupal has a basic version of that which can be extended through third-party modules, or so I understand, but it is still quite a complex thing to set up and integrate with the rest of the Drupal site. This is what, you know, the Aluent techs have told me. It's possible, but it's expensive. And it seems like Drupal has potentially more capabilities in that direction than Joomla. All right, let's talk about site access and membership. You know, upon install, you know, both will have default support for being able to log in and conduct administrative and production tasks. Both will have basic account sign up and member self-administration. So there's like in Drupal, there's is it a members module, I think, but it gives you, you know, you can sign up for an account and you can use it to log into the site and things like that. Kind of like in Joomla. Both also have a framework for access control structures for permissions and things like that. Here's the overview of Joomla. Users are assigned to groups, which are custom and hierarchical and can be custom defined however you want. Access levels for the front end. There's a group of initial default groups in ACL, which is available to Joomla, which you can jump in and, you know, that's the author, editor, publisher stuff. And on the back end, manager, administrator, super administrator. Permissions inherit and propagate to, it goes from component to category to content item in terms of how you can define these permissions. And then I call this universal enhanced CRUD. CRUD stands for create, read, update, and delete. But basically there's the same set of permission options for Joomla that propagates through all Joomla components. You know, it's like, can you access the component? Can you view content items in it? Can you edit your own items, things like that? And then you can set these levels, at the component level, the category level, and then the content item level, and it inherits and can propagate down the hierarchy. Drupal's a bit different. Drupal installs with 2 initial roles. So you've got a new Drupal installation, you've got an anonymous role or public user role, and then you have the quote-unquote authenticated role with a single user account in the authenticated group for super administrator and to begin building out the website. Okay, roles tie into permissions, options for modules, and display options and blocks. So this is another characteristic of Drupal, where you can have these user roles that are set up and defined, but then you get to decide like where and how they're applied within the Drupal system. It could be at a module level where, this, like a Joomla component deciding what a particular user group can and can't do, or it could be a display level option on the blocks level. So again, this is another characteristic difference between the two. The Drupal developer has all of these options for how they potentially could develop these roles and tie them into site content and functionality. From what I've seen, I say modules are not cruddy in terms of each Drupal module has the ability to release its own set of specific permissions to user groups. So it's not like Joomla, and you yell at me if I'm wrong, but I think this is the case. Joomla, every component you can read, create, delete, et cetera, et cetera. It seems like in Drupal, a module could have a much more specific permission setting that says a user may edit this following field, or a user may...
Yeah, you can really get as specific as you want. It depends on which, I think initially like the core like contact permissions are, create this content type, edit this content type, view this content type. I think are like the 3 main ones that come out initially, but you can get more specific and, edit your own, edit any, and then it gets all the way down to the specific field level too.
Yes, and that's...
where you can limit who can fill in which fields.
Yes, exactly. That's another key difference, right? You cannot, or there's no native capabilities or core capabilities for Joomla to go into a content item and say, okay, this group of users can go into an article and they can change the title, but this group of users can't. I guess there are maybe some front-end stuff for that, but it's real basic. It is a systemic capability inside of Drupal that ties into how you build out these content types. Yeah.
You could do that in Joomla. It's just not present in the core.
Right. It's
a third-party developer could go in and write those rules.
Yes, but you would have to go in and write those rules. And I guess the approach is you generally don't do that. Whereas it seems like in Drupal, it's kind of like, oh, well, of course you might want the option to control field access. Is that the case, or?
Yeah, pretty much. It's not core. The specific field permissions aren't core. It's a third party or contrib module.
Okay.
But it's there.
Okay.
It's very common. It gets used all the time.
Yeah, I was going to say it seems like a real commonly used thing when building out Drupal sites.
Many of the modules we use are contrib. In other words, somebody outside, they're not core.
Right. That's been my understanding too. And so I think that's another real profound difference or potential difference between Drupal and Joomla. Drupal, you can build it down to this very granular level. Here's another thing that I found out about Drupal, which is in terms of implementing this stuff, and how you apply your user roles to all of these systemic elements, it's up to you. It's up to the developer entirely. I've seen some modules that support tying user roles to taxonomy schema. I've seen some modules that support tying user roles to nodes. And I guess I'm just comparing and contrasting here. Joomla's kind of got this, okay, here's how you do permissions. Drupal, it really is wide open in terms of how the end developer might choose to implement those permissions within the system. I've heard about developer recipes. So like a lot of times the developer community will share their knowledge. Hey, this worked really well for me. Kind of these developing best practices for how to implement some of these membership features. And then there's also something called Drupal distros, right? Which is basically a ready to install version of Drupal, which is already set up for, say, a community site or a civic site or whatever it might be. And a lot of times you can take one of those, drop it in, and turn it on, and it's got a lot of this core functionality that's already been configured, and you kind of gives you a base to work from. I guess it's the equivalent of like Community Builder is coming out with some of these packages too that you just pick up and drop right in, and it's turnkey community because all the configuration work and all the heavy lifting's been done for you. I've also read about families of specialized modules, different modules that work together to support this type of site access and membership features. So it might not be just one discrete module, it might be a couple of different modules, maybe one's for display, one's for backend stuff or whatever, but they're designed to work together, and they seem to be distributed as a common solution for accomplishing specific tasks. All right, let's talk about Avery's favorite topic, search engine optimization. So much of this comes down to template and theme specific stuff, proper HTML markup structure, get your headers in the H1s, source ordering of content, get the good stuff at the top of the HTML document. There's also some operator and producer specific stuff, file naming conventions, fill in those alt tags for your images. And then between Joomla and Drupal, there are some similar capabilities that both have. Both have meta tags. So or can support meta tags. In Drupal, that would be done by you have your content type, and you would create a new field for the meta tag.
There's a meta tag module.
Okay, well there's a meta tag module that takes care of that. That takes care of that then for you. Both can implement sitemaps, and there are third-party modules both for Drupal and the third-party extensions for Joomla that do it automatically, or you can roll your own. Control over HTML page titles. Both also have a redirect component. Joomla's got its awesome redirect component. Drupal has something similar. Where I've seen some real differences is in SEF URLs. So Joomla has its global, Joomla has its global config setting, and then it has the aliases. So you've got a menu item or a piece of content or whatever. There's an alias field that rides along with that. You type in whatever you want, or it'll just feed from the title, and it'll become part of your SEF URL. And then there's the global config settings to turn SEF URLs on or off, and a couple of other options, and it works with the mod rewrite capabilities of the Apache web server and an htaccess file. Drupal has a clean URL setting, which is real similar to Joomla. It uses mod rewrite on Apache, it uses htaccess. And it's a switch that you turn on at the top level, but it results in non-ideal syntax. In other words, although it might get rid of the, question mark equal sign, item ID equals blah, 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 it'll still say stuff like, mysite.com/number/node, or, it has things that aren't related to the content of it. Now, I've read about extra modules, I think it's called Path-Auto or something like that. Path-Auto, that enables search engine friendly URLs in a Drupal site, but the trick is it's like a programmatic thing, right? You have to go in and you configure that module to build the SEF URLs according to whatever conditions you want.
Yeah, you make it sound a lot more daunting than it really is.
Okay.
It's not a big deal. All it is you turn on Path-Auto, and then you go to the Path-Auto screen, and it lists all your content types, and then you have a pattern that you set for each content type. And then we have another module called tokens, which provides little things that you can copy and paste into your URL. So you could be like, I want it to be, like say if you have a content type recipes, well you type in, okay, well I want my path to be recipes / then the node title, or recipes / cooking time / node title.
Sure.
So you can plug in any of your fields, your taxonomy terms, and it'll convert that pretty quickly.
And that results in a tremendous amount of flexibility. You can probably get exactly what you want automatically based on what's there, but you got to set that up. And I just compare that. It's Joomla. It's kind of just turn it on in one location and it does it, but it maybe doesn't give you the same level of control that Path-Auto does. Of course, there are some third-party Joomla products that'll tweak SEF URLs and things like that. Let's talk about site performance. Both benefit from common performance enhancements. The delivery networks can support that easily. Efficient HTML, get that crap out of there. Fast hosting. Both have site caching mechanisms and controls. Drupal has a cool feature that it includes a CSS JavaScript aggregator. At the top level, it's like a global config thing. You just turn it on. It'll aggregate that stuff for the site. And one of the biggest differences in terms of site performance is they have different approaches to caching. Joomla caching, you got your top level global config, and maybe you got some module specific caching, but it's time based. You know, it's let the cache expire after how many hours or however many days or whatever. Drupal caching is a bit different. It does have global cache settings, which can be enhanced by other modules on sort of a global level. But then the interesting thing is that caching options can propagate throughout the Drupal site. It can go into modules, blocks, panels, etc. So you can write your specific caching preferences, you know, at this granular level. And among other things, you know, it can be both time-based, but it can be logic-based caching as well, right? So you can say, okay, only flush the cache on this particular block once the following conditions have been met. Once a user has changed an element that, you know, would require an update. So you can see you can get a lot more granular control. And then I've also read about some tie-ins to server level caching, some modules that talk to APC and Varnish, which can really, which are server level programs that provide caching. And it seems like Drupal has some tie-ins or focus at that level, you know, which may be a bit beyond what Joomla has to offer. All right, let's just talk a little bit about software engineering, which is just the process of building the site and kind of figuring out what the parts are that need to fit together. That could just be picking your modules, picking your Joomla components and whatnot, or it could actually be, you know, designing the code structure for your object-oriented component. In Joomla, we've got our extension system, and then we got the ecosystem too, you know, so all of these third-party developers providing it. But it pretty much comes down to components, modules, and plugins. Components are these, you know, monolithic, feature-rich elements which reside in Joomla and can do a variety of things. In Joomla, modules are the user-facing widgets that drop into different positions, and then plugins are the actions that fire off according to specific activities or things that go on the site. Joomla is object-oriented design by default, so the Joomla project says, you know, this is an object-oriented system that uses the model view controller architecture. And so they officially say, this is how we write our code, this is how we model and build our software. There's also an interesting thing going on with Joomla's separation of CMS from platform. So all of the content management system specific code has been moved into its own area that's separate from like a lot of the base functions and classes, which is now called the Joomla platform. You know, what I see this being the potential for is, you know, you could have Joomla ERP or Joomla CRM or something like that in addition to Joomla CMS. You know, and I consider like the platform move to be the sign of a maturing piece of software and something that's very interesting from Joomla. And then, you know, like I mentioned before, it's well-established directed development. From what I've seen, if you're going to get involved in Joomla development, you know, you're kind of going to be coloring in between the lines. You know, you're going to be given specific examples of how your component should be constructed, and be constructed with model view controller, object-oriented design, and there are published coding standards like syntax standards for Joomla, you know, where they say, okay, and I forget the exact name of it, but they say your code should conform to the following exact syntax, you know, to be quote unquote proper. You know, and Joomla's officially adopted that. Drupal's a bit different. As we've been talking about before, and like with the content types and fields and how this stuff gets built, it's all self-built structures and architecture. The Drupal developer is like deciding a lot of this structure as they're building the site and defining it according to what the site should accomplish. All right, system elements connect via hooks. Now a hook is a standardized PHP function with specific names that are, you know, found throughout Drupal, in particular in modules have a lot of hooks. And I hope I'm not getting out of my depth here, but basically it allows one part of Drupal to talk to the hooks of another part of Drupal, go in, get information, get resources, and leverage that into its own programmatic process. And so Drupal tends to, you know, all of these elements tend to talk back and forth much more through this system of standardized hooks. Is that?
Yeah, well, like if you have something that requires, like if you're writing, I can't think of a name, good example right now, but if you were to do something that required custom PHP input, you would use hooks to call things from the different parts.
Yes, yes. Drupal has an extensive API, or a formal API, whereas Joomla doesn't really have that. It has more of the platform type approach. Drupal also has a full database abstraction layer, which means that you can write your database queries once and then that they will apply to any of the supported databases. Joomla doesn't have that yet. Among other things, you can run Drupal on Oracle, but you can't, yes?
Joomla has full database abstraction
as of 2.5, okay, I stand corrected then. One of the supported databases, the big one that I noticed that is not yet supported by Joomla is Oracle. It's in the works. Both can support Microsoft SQL Server, both come from MySQL. Can Drupal support PostgreSQL? I think it can.
Probably.
Yeah, and maybe one other.
I've been told to say in regards to those types of questions, yes.
Yes, okay. Yes, it can. Just pay more money. Pay me more money and we'll make it work.
I don't even know if that's necessarily the case. I mean, all of our stuff is free. You guys have to pay for your app.
Well, we do, and we're gonna get to that. The other thing about Drupal is, it seems like it doesn't have the same level of mandated software design patterns that Joomla has. If you're a developer and you're developing your own module, within that module you can kind of do whatever you want, and nobody cares. Whereas in Joomla, yes, there's some ability to do those sorts of things, but there are these established standards and structures. Now,
If you're submitting to, I want this to be part of the Joomla platform, part of the Joomla CMS,
okay,
you are absolutely bound to those.
but doesn't that?
If you want to build your own extension, you are free to do so.
Okay, but doesn't that, because of the MVC design patterns and the way it hooks into HTML overrides and other parts of the Joomla system, it seems like it's just more structured. I mean, I hear like these stories about, Drupal.
You make it easier on the people maintaining it or wanting to change something without changing the core of the system by following those standards.
Yes.
Make it easier for people to override the template, but
yeah, it'll still work.
As long as you make it work with Joomla 2.5, I think now it's actually, there may be something where you have to do MVC, but I'm not sure you actually have to actually have a product work.
The thing that I've seen is like Joomla pushes it more, I guess.
As somebody who writes code for a living every day, what I've learned is through the Joomla project, they have definitely made, I don't have a CS degree, I have a art degree, and they've definitely pushed me to be more like tools that people who went to school for coding and programming.
Yes. So I guess there's this promulgating more structure. And whereas in Drupal, it seems like, hey man, whatever's groovy, man.
And with some of it, it's about like best practices.
Yes.
And that's kind of what they're trying to push, is more of best practice of how to do something, because it sometimes can lead to less headaches,
yes,
less security issues,
less
sometimes
janitorial work, cleaning up the mess of others.
But it doesn't necessarily mean you won't have security issues.
Sure.
Because it's all about what you do with it once you start using it.
I guess my point is that Joomla seems to push more structure, ideally, on the developer, and the Drupal it's a bit more open. Although there certainly are best practices that I've read about that have been developed and things like that. It seems like you have more freedom to.
To be 100% honest, I mean the people that really develop and write and maintain popular modules, they all kind of know each other. They're also working on core Drupal. There's a lot of interaction. We have a really, really tight community. So like, you don't really see too many like rogue modules out there that people are like, hey, don't use that one.
And that's what my understanding too. It's like all the core stuff, all the popular modules. It's solid software. It's been vetted enough. It's been developed enough that it's
weird. Like you might find some weird one out there that isn't so great. But I mean, it's buyer beware.
Yes. One difference I wanted to hit on is the practical matter of when you're building a Joomla site. You're gonna look at using your core extensions. You're gonna look at going out and finding third-party extensions if you have to support it, and then you kind of adjust to fit. And hopefully you get close enough to the requirements that your client will be happy. Drupal is kind of custom built from the roof down. You can build exactly what you want, and you kind of have to build exactly what you want. Another interesting characteristic is how Joomla silos its information and capabilities, whereas Drupal seems to spread it out much more. So, in Joomla, you've got a component. That component's probably, just talking to the backend administrator interfaces to be able to use it, and maybe it's talking to a module, and maybe it's talking to a plugin. Whereas Drupal, you could have a Drupal module or a Drupal process that connects to all of these different aspects of the Drupal system and leverages different data and even programmatic resources from other modules, and it's all kind of this big integrated mass. And so that was another big characteristic that I saw. Maintenance and support. Joomla's pretty easy to hand off between developers. It's kind of the standardized thing. Most every backend looks like most every other backend. One characteristic of Joomla is that when folks are administering it or producing content, it tends to expose, especially on the back end, a lot of controls to content managers and producers that maybe they don't need. Maybe they never will need and never need to see, but they're still going to see those menu items. They're still going to see those options that are there that maybe they will use or won't use. That could be good and bad, right? You could have a resource at a client who you're training up, and they want to take on more and more administrative stuff, and it's much more accessible for them to do that in Joomla. On the other hand, maybe you just got someone who just is cranking out content, and the interface needs to be as simplified as possible, right? In Joomla you got all this other distracting stuff, which isn't maybe the case in Drupal. Joomla also has these one-click incremental updates, where you go into Joomla, one click, basically your core application is updated. That characteristic is showing up in all of the third-party extensions as well. It's like one-click updates, making it as easy as possible. And then another big characteristic is there is actually a path for upgrading from major version to major version of Drupal, to Joomla, excuse me. Going from Joomla 1.5 to 1.6 to 2.5 is pretty painful, but there still was a method available for it, and I did it, and you could do it with the core content, and I found enough support for the third-party stuff. I could still make it work. And so that's something about Joomla that's pretty good. From what I've heard and seen, Drupal's difficult to hand off. A Drupal site's difficult to hand off between developers because it is so custom built, and especially a Drupal site which is larger or more complex could be built in any number of different ways, to the point where it may take the Drupal developer more time to figure out what the hell the asshat did who came earlier than it does to tear everything down and build it again. And you just said that, and that happens that happens a lot, it sounds like. Okay, so you can't, it's so complex, you can't really hand this stuff off between developers. And one thing I'll mention is, as a characteristic of that, like Drupal sites, a lot of times they'll drag the original developer in tow, right? You got a Drupal site, it's an important site, they're going to have to get that original developer involved because he's the only guy who understands what the hell's going on.
Yeah, but to be 100%, if it's developed properly, I mean, not necessarily like the way I would do it, but if it's done without much hacking, then I can usually look at it and figure it out.
Sure, yeah, there's probably all different levels of subtlety. And
people that get in there and that don't understand what Drupal can actually do, like as Drupal, and they just go in there and do all their custom PHP and stuff, that screws me up.
Yep. Yep. And I think that can certainly happen in Joomla. I mean, I've encountered messy Joomla projects before, certainly, but it seems like the level of digging in, figuring out what the hell's going on, it might be less in Joomla than it is in Drupal. Whereas Joomla, as I was saying before, exposes all these options to the end user. Ideally, the Drupal site is streamlined. All right, I'm almost done, guys, for the end user. And so, maybe there's not as much control immediately available, but they can just get in there and crank that stuff out. Incremental updates seem to be slightly harder just because you've got to upload files potentially and overwrite things in the server, like the old style of Joomla. What I've heard is there's no effective way to upgrade between major versions of Drupal. Now, there certainly may be sites where that is capable, but as a practical matter, what I've heard is that because of the customization involved, because of the changes between modules, which might or might not be employed in the Drupal site, and also because of platform changes, but between major Drupal versions, it may be the point where yes, you could upgrade, but it would take less time to actually build it from scratch in the new version of Drupal than try to go through this upgrade or migration process. I wanted to just throw down this comparison of nomenclature so that you can see there's like some similar concepts between both projects, but you know, they kind of call them different things, and these aren't one-to-one comparisons, you know, rough comparison component to module, same thing with module and block, certainly with tags and vocabularies, but this gives you an idea of, you know, there are some similar things between the content management systems. Okay, now here's the free piece of awesomeness, which I was telling you about. You can get all of this information and more through our free ebook. We're offering this ebook that you guys can download from aluent.com/ebook. It goes into quite a bit more depth than what we covered tonight. And you just gotta, you know, sign up on a form to get it. It will shoot it straight to your email address. And I hope that it can be a really valuable resource for folks. I certainly welcome any feedback or thoughts that folks have about it. But I encourage folks to get over there and sign up.
Any problem with us putting it on our website?
Yes, because it has to. We can link to it, but
that's what I mean.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Us putting it on our site since it's going to be public.
No, just we want to distribute it through our forum so we can. We're doing it. It's a part of an inbound marketing campaign, so we want to capture people's.
Make sure before we put it up there.
No, you can link to it. Absolutely.
So it'll be
okay.